All right, here we are at part two of the Theory of Evolution lecture series. What's in store for this part is a more detailed inquiry into the nature of microevolution. So recall that microevolution is the process by which allele frequencies will change in a population. Remember, according to the Hardy-Weinberg principle, in theory, allele frequencies should not change in a population generation after generation, unless there are certain exceptions, and those exceptions I call disruptions. And these are some of the examples of things that will uh, lead to an exception in the rule, which will lead to a change in allele frequencies within a population. And that is, in essence, what needs to happen if evolution ever were to occur. Okay, the first one we're going to talk about is natural selection, because natural selection was one of the first to be well characterized and elaborated on and described at length and submitted in a publication. We generally think of Charles Darwin when we think of natural selection. He gets most of the credit here. But if you go to a garden in Paris, you might find a statue of this gentleman, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and on that statue will be this inscription: the founder of the doctrine of evolution. So the French are going to try and claim that a Frenchman was the one who came up with the theory. But remember, anywhere thinking humans have been on the planet, the view of evolution has been present, and its popularity has waned and waxed, and it has at times lacked a proper mechanism to explain it. But nonetheless, the idea, at least, that species are changing on their own um, due to the forces of nature, that idea has been present since the beginning of civilization for the most part. Okay, but what's interesting about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is that he actually published a mechanism for evolution, but his mechanism was incorrect. So the idea that he put forth was one in which individuals will change in their lifetime, and then they will pass on those changes to their offspring. So a good example would be like, let's say there's a tree, and on that tree there's a high branch, and then there's a giraffe that wants to, eat the leaves on the tree. And so the giraffe can just barely reach the leaves on the tree, so it strains its neck even further and further and further. And during the course of its life, because it's always straining its neck, straining its neck, straining its neck gets slightly longer, and then it passes on those slightly longer neck genes to its offspring, so that when they are born, they're going to reach adulthood with a longer neck because of the parents passed on that gene. That's an analogy to describe Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's mechanism. That is incorrect, though, because it's not the case that our traits that change and accumulate in an individual for a lifetime will be passed on to their offspring. It might be that, with a few exceptions, but for the most part, the theory of evolution has to be undergirded by the premise that it's in the genes. There's something genetically that's passed on. And generally speaking, our genes during our lifetime are not changed. We inherit a genome, and that genome is going to give us certain traits, and those traits might get altered. The phenotypes might get altered, but generally those alterations don't also come with a genetic basis. So in other words, your genome isn't likely changing to a drastic degree throughout your life. Now, there could be certain mutations that some of your cells incur, but the original genome, of which all of your cells inherited from the original zygote, that genome doesn't get changed. And so Lamarck's theory would suggest that it does change, and then those changes get passed on your offspring. But in reality, that's not really what happens. Okay, so a mechanism to describe the process of evolution would have to get to a more of a genetic basis in which traits are passed on through the generations. And so it's actually the offspring inheriting traits that has to be the mechanism by which evolution would occur. And that is an idea that was better summarized by Charles Darwin. And so even though his Charles Darwin's idea came a little bit later on the scene after Lamarck's, it was the more accurate idea because in it he summarized this type of relationship. So Charles Darwin is a British naturalist, and he sailed all around the world, and it was his job to collect various specimens on his voyages. And on one such voyage, he went to the Galapagos Islands, which are right off the coast of Ecuador. And on the islands, he saw that there are several different types of finches. And he speculated, or basically he was observing the finches and saw that some of them were better at cracking nuts. So there was a part of the island where there was a lot of nuts present, and in that part, there were more of these finches that had strong, broad beaks that would be better suited for cracking nuts. On other parts of the island, there were more flowers, and there were insects that were found in those flowers, and he watched as birds that had narrower beaks were able to get into the flowers and pull the insects out. And so whether a bird had a real broad, big, strong beak, or whether it had a more slender, narrow beak, those varying qualities conferred greater advantage in one particular environment, and then that advantage was done away with if the environment changed. So, for example, if all of these birds with these types of beaks went to the same place where these birds were with all of the, the strong nuts, where their beaks were no longer strong enough to crack them open, they would be less at an advantage. But in the part of the island where there was flowers and insects in those flowers, these ones had the greater advantage. So Darwin thought on this for a little bit and basically came up with the idea of natural selection, that there are certain traits that give an organism a greater advantage in a particular environment. And so species over time, through the generations, if they're well adapted to a particular environment, it will draw out certain traits, and then it's basically changes in the environment that lead to favor of certain traits over others. So it's the interaction of an organism with its particular environment that will select out the traits and cause those traits to be passed on to the next generation. This idea was published in his book, The Origin of the Species, and it's one of the first elaborations on the idea of natural selection, that in nature certain traits would be selected because they are better suited for a particular environment. Okay, so the way that you could summarize natural selection is basically if an organism is better adapted to its environment, meaning it has certain traits or features that are better suited in a particular environment, then those organisms with those traits will be able to survive and likely reproduce. Now, this is the most important part. When we talk about natural selection, another word that often gets discussed is the word fitness. And so there are some organisms that are more fit to a particular environment than other organisms. And one's fitness is determined in at least natural selection predominantly by their ability to reproduce. So it's not necessarily the case that the traits that allow an organism to survive better during its life are necessarily those organisms that are more fit. It's which organism can reproduce. So, for example, if a lion was very, very strong and it could outcompete all of its competitors, but for some reason it had some traits that made it less likely to reproduce, even though that lion in its lifetime would be more fit per se, in that it could outcompete its competitors, because it's not as well suited to reproduce, it would actually be considered less fit. So being able to reproduce is the key um, to an organism being more fit than another organism. And so if the organism can survive better, then it's likely the chance that it will also be able to have more opportunities to reproduce. And so then the organisms that are more likely to reproduce are then more likely to pass their alleles onto the subsequent generations. And then slowly through, through many, many generations, there will be a selection of certain traits that are passed down to the offspring. Of all the different traits that were in a population of species, one of those traits, the alleles will get selected out, and that allele will become more and more common as the generations continue. Okay, that's natural selection. All right, now what's also interesting to discuss is Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace is kind of famous for being not famous in a way. Sort of his story is that he also went on he was a naturalist and went on a lot of expeditions as well, some of them with Charles Darwin. And Darwin and him were comrades. They were buddies. They had a lot of the similar talks and lines of thought regarding the theory of natural selection. And Alfred Wallace was actually writing and getting ready to publish some of the same ideas, and Darwin beat him to it. And so he was the one that developed all the fame, and Alfred Wallace was kind of more of the forgotten one. But I think there's no hard feelings here. In fact, when Wallace returned from some of his journeys, he made some poor speculations and made some bad bets on mining ventures and other types of venture capital pursuits, and he lost a good portion of his money, and to the point that he needed to start selling all of his specimens that he had collected from his voyages just in order to pay the bills. And then when all the specimens were sold, then he had to start selling all his furniture, and just about when he had nothing left, Charles Darwin really went to bat for him and petitioned to the state to get him a pension to honor all of the work that he had done for the British Empire, serving as a naturalist. So even though Darwin beat Wallace to the punch in his publication, I think Wallace still espoused Charles Darwin. He upheld Charles Darwin and promoted his fame. Now there's an interesting side story here which doesn't really get to much of what we're trying to talk about here, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk about it. So there's an interesting book that was written recently called The Feather Thief, and it's a book about the obsession of salmon fly fishing ties. So if you've ever been fly fishing or you've heard of fly fishing, people will often make their own ties. They tie their own fly lures. And there are trout lures, which look, just like a regular old fly, but then there are salmon lures, which don't look like any natural living thing. There's kind of like it's more of an art form, and it's a very, very, very interesting world. It's like the stock market of high value, precious commodities. People will treat their art of tying a salmon fly very seriously, and some of these will go for thousands of dollars, and some of them are really, really rare, and so on and so forth. So there is a gentleman named Edwin Rist who was a flautist, and he had heard about the craze of salmon fly fishing, and he was trying to raise money so that he could buy a golden flute. And what he did is he broke into the Natural History Museum at Tring in England, and he stole some of Alfred Wallace's birds. So in the same way Darwin had his finches, so Alfred Wallace also had a lot of birds, and they were on display at this museum. He stole a sack of about 299 birds. I think not all of them were Alfred Wallace's, but he did steal a few of Alfred Wallace's. And he basically plucked the feathers off and sold them on basically the the fly fisherman's black market, because these were really, really highly sought after birds. I mean, these birds are 150 years old, and they had all these vibrant vibrant feathers, and he made just a heinous amount of money selling these birds. So it's a really interesting story. You can read all about it in this book, The Feather Thief. There's even a few podcasts about it. But Alfred Wallace makes another appearance into the history books here for this really interesting burglary that occurred, so that Edwin could buy his gold flute. Okay, moving on. A couple examples of natural selection. One, there's a couple, Peter and Rosemary Grant, who are tenured faculty at Princeton, and they've spent a lot of time studying the populations of finches on the Galapagos, the same as Darwin. And in one example, and they were studying some finches in 1976, and then there was a drought. So there's a drought in 1977. In that drought, the small seeds, because it was so dry, the small seeds dried out faster and didn't make it through the drought. So there was more large seeds than there were small seeds. And because there are more large seeds than there were small seeds, the large seeds are better consumed, and they're more easily cracked open by birds with larger beaks. So they went the following year to find out all the survivors. The drought had really wiped out a lot of the birds. You can see that they was 750 birds that they tallied in 1976, and it was only 90 birds in 1978. And when they measured their average beak size, the depth of their beak, they found there was a slight increase in the beak. So in other words, because those birds with larger beaks were able to crack open the larger seeds, more of them survived and passed their genes on. So even within a year, the beak's depth had on average increased. Now, keep in mind this probably isn't statistically significant, I wouldn't say, because here we're looking at a beak depth of 9.5 millimeters, and here there's about 10.2, and it's only a sample size of 90. So it's a very, 0.7 millimeters is a very, 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 very small amount. But nevertheless, we're seeing a gradual shift here. Another pretty famous example that's cited often is the peppered moth. There are two types shown here. One is the Carbonaria, and the other is the Typica. So that would be the white one and the black one. And there's a famous survey that was performed by Dr. Kettlewell in the 1950s, where they went around and he made a tally of the abundance of white moths versus black moths in clean parts of the woods versus more black parts of the woods. So the idea is that when the Industrial Revolution happened, there was parts of the woods where there was more soot landing on the forest, and so because there was more soot landing on the forest, the trees were black. And so if you consider this scenario here, before Industrial Revolution, you can see if the trees are white on the birch trees and such, that those moths that have a white color will be more camouflaged. These ones will be more easily spotted and preyed upon. And so after the Industrial Revolution, when the trees become more black because of the soot, then it's the black peppered moths that are more camouflaged, and the white ones are more easily preyed upon. And so in essence, a summary of Kettlewell's observations looks something like this, where before the Industrial Revolution there were much more white moths than there were black moths, because these ones were able to survive. They were better camouflaged. And then over the years it flip-flopped, and now there was much more black moths than there were white moths, because those were the ones that were camouflaged. So here the white allele is diminishing and the black allele is increasing. We're getting a change in allele frequencies due to an organism's fitness. In other words, its ability to survive long enough to reproduce. The ones that best blend in with their environment are able to survive longer and have a better chance at reproducing, which means they have a better chance at passing their alleles on. All right, so that's a little bit about natural selection. And one of the other disruptions that we'll talk about here is environmental variance. This one's interesting because environmental variance means an instance in which an organism's trait is determined by the environment. So in how the environment is acting, or the conditions of the environment rather, would make a trait more or less likely in the population. A good example of this is the American alligator. Alligators are unique in that the likelihood of them being born either male or female is dependent upon the temperature in which they are incubated. If the incubation temperature is about 33 degrees Celsius, then nearly all of them that are born as males. If the temperature is higher than that, so like 34, 35, then it starts to taper off, or if it's less, it starts to taper off. And if it's below 31 degrees, the incubation temperature, then they're all born female. There's no males born. So in this sense, what the various alleles that would be present in either a male and not present in a female, the frequency of those alleles would be altered by something like temperature. Another disruption is genetic drift. And genetic drift, generally speaking, is basically, you can think about it in this way, that chance events may have a greater impact on changing allele frequency when there are small populations. Okay, so to illustrate this, consider this. Imagine that you flip a coin three times. How likely is it that you'll get 100% heads? Well, it's about 1 out of 6. It would be possible in theory. I mean, it's not likely, but I bet you if you do it a few times, like 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 times, you will eventually, flip a coin 3 times and have it be heads all 3 times in a row. Now, if you flipped a coin 100 times, how likely would it be to get 100% heads? Almost impossible, right? It would be extraordinarily unlikely. So chance events, when there is a small sample size, can lead to trends that are abnormal, maybe would be a way to say it, or unnatural. So like if we considered 2 populations here, what if it was the case that whatever organism this was decided to breed with this organism, and then this one died? Well, then this allele, we could call it the green allele, whatever the green allele is, would be passed on, and this one would be, perhaps totally extinct. In this scenario, it just takes only one organism not mating for their allele to completely be eradicated. Whereas if there's a bigger population, and it would actually take a whole bunch of these to be eradicated in order for their alleles not to be passed on. So it becomes less likely that an allele frequency would change when there's a bigger population. It's more likely an allele frequency will change when there's a smaller population, just due to the random chance of it all. Now there are a couple of, I guess another illustration would be, let's imagine we have a fur coat of a rabbit, and brown fur is the dominant allele and white fur is the recessive. So here's homozygous recessive, here's homozygous recessive. And for whatever reason, it's just these 5 in this small population of 10 that are able to mate with one another and produce offspring. Well, if that was the case and they did produce offspring, then the second generation would look like this. This white allele is becoming less and less common. We're going from an allele frequency of half of the alleles being the dominant allele and the other half of the alleles being the recessive allele, if you count them all up. And then over here, it's 70% are the dominant allele and 30% are the recessive allele. And if in this population it was just this rabbit and this rabbit here that mated, and the rest of these never had a chance to reproduce, well, then the following population, the recessive allele would be totally eradicated. It would not even be present. This would be more likely to occur in a small population than it would be in a really, really large population where there are many opportunities to mate. All right, now there are a couple of special examples of genetic drift. One is called the bottleneck effect. And the bottleneck effect basically refers to any time there's an episode or an instance or something that happens that drastically reduces the population of organisms. An example of this would be, so they call it a bottleneck event because all of these other organisms here are not included, they perish, and there's just a select few that are going to survive. An example of this would be the northern elephant seal. So in the 1890s, a lot of different seals were hunted. And this particular species, the northern elephant seal, was reduced only down to about 20. Like literally only 20 of these seals were alive. So it became right on the brink of becoming extinct. And then of those 20, they bred and bred and bred and bred, and now there's over 30,000 of them. And if you look at all the different 30,000 that are around today, they have a very similar genetic composition. There isn't a lot of genetic variability between them all because they all sprouted from this very small population. So prior to 1890s, when there was many, many different types of northern elephant seal, they would have had a lot more genetic variability. They would have had different traits. And then when just the 20 were remaining, whatever alleles those 20 had were the only alleles that were passed on. So it's likely that many of the alleles were eradicated. Okay, another thing that can happen is the founder effect. What this means is if there's a certain allele in a population and a handful of the population leaves and goes to start another population. So you have a whole bunch of individuals that represent like more of a normal distribution of alleles in a big allele pool. And then if just a handful of those individuals leave and they go start a new population, then whatever, just by chance alone, whatever alleles that they had will be much more likely to reproduce in the next population, and a lot of the alleles that the other participants had in the population, they might, become eradicated or much more rare. An example of this is polydactyly in the American Amish. So in Amish populations in the United States, there's a much higher prevalence of polydactyly, which is an extra digit, so either an extra finger or an extra toe. And basically what must have happened is that some of the original founders of the Amish communities had that community had a higher percentage of polydactyly alleles in the population. And because that population is a little bit more isolated, that allele was somewhat selected out and became more and more common in that population relative to the other populations surrounding the Amish communities. All right, one last thing that I'm going to talk about here is gene flow. And basically, to summarize gene flow, what happens is a species of some kind migrates. So imagine you have two populations. This population has a certain set of allele frequencies, and this population has a certain set of allele frequencies. And if we bring an organism from this population over to this one, now whatever alleles that they are carrying are coming into the population, now starting to mix with the population. So if there was, for example, some allele that was totally eradicated in this population, and then this organism brought it in, now it's just reintroduced that allele, and it's going to start to become more and more prevalent in the population. So that means that it's a change in allele frequency because it's going from 0% to a higher percentage of organisms that have the allele. All right, we'll leave it at that. That's just a couple of examples of the various disruptions that can happen to cause changes in the allele frequency of a population. And again, the reason why this is important is because populations in which there is no change in the allele frequency are populations which are not evolving. So in order for an organism or a population to select out a trait or not, there has to be a change in the allele frequencies, and that has to happen through some of these mechanisms which we've just described. This is by no means a exhaustive list of all the different disruptions, but it is sort of a highlight of some of the more important ones, or the more well-known ones. All right, we're going to wrap it up for this part, and stay tuned for the next part. It will be a little bit of a bigger part where we talk about the theoretical process of speciation.